Brought to you by CGTN Europe.
I'm Stephen Cole. Welcome to the Agenda podcast. If the world is ever to return to anything like normality, experts agree we need to find a vaccine for COVID-19 as soon as possible. On this week's Agenda with Stephen Cole, we examine the hunt for a COVID-19 vaccine and consider when we might find that golden bullet. Joining me from Seoul to try and answer that and many other vaccine questions is Dr. Jerome Kim. And Dr. Kim is Director General of the International Vaccines Institute. Dr. Kim, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little more about how a vaccine is created.
Right. I think the first thing to remember is that, vaccines are based on a concept that we learned from the natural history of infectious diseases. And that is that, by and large, for most of the diseases that we've developed vaccines for, if you get the natural infection, if you get measles, or if you get mumps, or German measles, typically, for the rest of your life, once you recover, you'll be protected against that disease. So you're immune from reinfection. And really, a vaccine does exactly that. By taking a small part of a virus, or taking the virus itself and killing it with heat or formaldehyde, a vaccine developer can inject it into a human and create the same kind of defensive responses that the body makes when it's normally attacked by measles or mumps. And in doing that, the body generates these responses that are normally designed to rid the body of the infection. But instead, what those responses do is that they protect the individual against infection by the real virus or the real bacterium.
It's not just about developing a vaccine, though, is it? It's all about distributing it too. Right.
So, vaccines are developed in phases, and there are typically 3 phases that take 5 to 10 years. And the first phase, it's usually conducted in about 50 people or less. And it really looks to see whether the vaccine causes any safety signals or is associated with any bad side effects. We also look to see if the vaccine is kind of making the right protective responses, but the real goal of the first phase is to make sure the vaccine is safe. The second phase, we actually begin to look at the vaccine in what we call the target population. That is, what group of people are we going to use the vaccine in eventually when we finally have a vaccine that's licensed and ready for use in humans. Phase 3, we actually look to see if the vaccine is safe and effective. Does the vaccine protect against infection or disease? And then, after all of that is done, and usually, again, that's 5 to 10 years, you take that entire package of data, of information, and sometimes it's 100,000 pieces of paper, and you take it to the MHRA in the UK or the FDA in the United States and give them all of that and say, we believe that this vaccine protects. And the regulatory agency will look through all those documents and say, yes, we agree with you, or no, we don't agree with you. And if it's approved, then it goes to another group. Because, just because you have a vaccine that's ready for marketing doesn't mean that doctors around the world are going to prescribe it. So you actually have to have another group that tells you, yes, we agree this vaccine is ready, you should use it.
This is an incredibly long process, how you've described it. Human trials have started in the UK, but is that significant? Does that mean we could have a vaccine sooner rather than later?
Yes. So I think most people remember that in December of 2019, we knew absolutely nothing about this virus. And now we actually have a number of clinical trials going on in humans. And for vaccine development, now remember, a process that normally lasts 5 to 10 years, to get the first vaccines into humans, and the first one went into humans in the United States in March of 2020. So 3 months after really the virus was described and sequenced, we actually were testing a vaccine in humans, and that is a remarkably short timeline. I mean, most people, when they describe this, use the word unprecedented.
How quickly after that testing could it be applied to the general public?
Another very important question. So typically, when you're in the 5 to 10 year timeline, during the third phase, the final phase of testing, the company is usually building the manufacturing capacity. Because remember that in the end, a vaccine company is supposed to make money for its shareholders. So they don't want to have an approved vaccine sitting around waiting for the factory to be built. So typically they're building that capacity while the trial is still going on, hoping that the vaccine will succeed. This is a little different. So remember that we've compressed the timeline from 5 to 10 years to maybe 12 to 18 months if everything works well. So that means that the people who are funding the vaccine developers in this case will also have to help probably with the development of the manufacturing capacity to get these vaccines into humans quickly. And so that will happen probably during the final stage of testing. They'll be looking at companies that could potentially make this vaccine for human use.
And governments, of course, will be adding a lot of revenue. They will be paying for a lot of these tests because every government in the world wants to see a COVID-19 vaccine on the streets.
Yes, every government does, but not all the governments have the means to do so. So, maybe if you're the United States or China, you can put enough money into a company in order to get it to accelerate vaccine clinical development, and then, get the company to promise that when they have a vaccine, that you have the rights to the first, so many millions of doses. The other countries in this world, the UK is among them, Norway, Germany, Japan, India, and others have joined an organization called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. The Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have also contributed to CEPI. And the idea behind CEPI is, let's put together funding and collectively develop a vaccine so that for these outbreak diseases, which are very unpredictable, and of course, COVID-19 is the perfect example of one, we can accelerate vaccine clinical development. So we no longer have to wait 5 to 10 years. Maybe we can do it faster. And when we all succeed, then potentially we can all benefit.
But how do you make sure that all the scientists are working together? I know the WHO is coordinating the efforts, but as you say, there is a scramble. There's a race in China, the UK, the US, to take 3 examples, to find this vaccine. How do you coordinate so much science, which is so widely distributed?
I think that having a core funder like CEPI will mean that there is a group of countries and scientists who are looking at all the products that are funded, potentially can compare the defensive responses that are developed. And in the end, do they want to test all 9 of the vaccines that they currently are paying for, or do they want to pick the top 2 or the top 3 and take only those forward? And when they do that, are they going to look at the vaccines that look the most promising, or vaccines that are associated with big companies that can rapidly manufacture and scale up production? I mean, the choices that need to be made are ones that have to be discussed. I mean, in a big company, if you were Merck or GSK or Johnson & Johnson, you might be able to do it all on your own. And typically that's what the big companies do. But a lot of the groups that were chosen initially by CEPI and are faster are small biotech companies. The other part of this is that we all have to recognize that COVID-19 is a global pandemic. And until we can vaccinate enough people around the world and give more people the benefit of vaccination, then really the world will not be safe from COVID or the next pandemic virus. We have to work together in order to show that these vaccines work and then distribute the vaccine equitably with access to everyone.
More than 100 vaccines are now at various stages of development, and a handful of those already being trialled in humans. I spoke to Stephen Kissler at the Harvard School of Public Health and Evan H. Bloch from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine about the different therapies being used in the hunt for a COVID-19 vaccine. Stephen, first, your research suggests that social distancing on its own is likely to be insufficient to fight COVID-19, doesn't it?
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. And you're exactly right. It seems that social distancing will allow us to prevent cases from overwhelming our critical care capacities within hospitals. But if we do stay on top of that and we don't have a treatment or we don't have a vaccine that becomes available, we'll have to be at that for a very long time before enough immunity builds up in the population for us to actually emerge from this pandemic.
Could you have too much social distancing? Would that be a bad thing?
Well, from an epidemiological standpoint, I suppose not. If we're only paying attention to this particular illness. But of course, social distancing comes along with all sorts of other costs that are social and economic. And, we've also heard reports of people who might be holding back from going to the hospital for other conditions, other severe conditions that they might have for fear of contracting COVID. Now, that might not be actually a social distancing-based phenomenon, but nevertheless, it's very clear that, that social distancing can have lots of negative knock-on effects that we really need to be aware of.
Evan Bloch, your research has been looking at the potential of COVID-19 plasma transfusions.
Sure.
Now, that's a therapy technique that hasn't been used in the United States anyway for some considerable time. Can you tell us how it works?
Sure. So it's actually been used for over a century in different settings, both in the context of post-exposure prophylaxis as well as for treatment for diverse infectious diseases. So, the premise is fairly simple. What's happening is, unlike vaccination, where one's really provoking an active immune response with convalescent plasma, what one's doing is one's collecting plasma from someone who has recovered from the infection, develops antibodies, and then one transfers those antibodies passively, either through infusion or transfusion, into someone who has been exposed and is at risk of COVID-19 or who has active disease.
Evan, though, is this feasible for the treatment of large numbers of people, treatment on a global scale?
So absolutely. So, one of the advantages of convalescent plasma is that it's readily scalable because one can leverage pre-existing blood transfusion infrastructure or collection infrastructure, both in high-income countries where most of the focus is at the moment, but also in low middle-income countries where one can similarly do this through whole blood collections.
Are plasma transfusions a long-term solution, or are they temporary?
So that's a great question. I would see this really as a temporizing measure, pending availability of more defined strategies, such as vaccine development or hyperimmune globulin. Unfortunately, if one looks at the timeline to developments of those, one's looking at months to, in the context of vaccines, potentially years. Pending availability.
So in the absence, Stephen, of a vaccine, is there still the argument then for the herd immunity?
Well, there is to some extent. If that immunity lasts long enough, then there is a scenario in which we could drive the number of cases of this illness low enough through herd immunity that then we could shift strategy and either eliminate the virus, similar to what we did with SARS, or at least have it at low enough levels that other interventions like contact tracing become feasible again. But of course, at this point, what we need is as many different interventions and treatments as possible, because every little bit helps here.
Evan Bloch, there's still an awful lot we don't know about COVID-19. Is it dangerous to start clinical trials as they've started to do in China, US and UK when we know so little?
I think that there's sufficient data, just looking at the convalescent plasma part of this, I think that there's sufficient data where convalescent plasma has been used in China and Italy and through an expanded access program in the US. There's probably been over 1,000 transfusions to date. It seems to be, just looking at the safety signal, it seems to be relatively well tolerated, which is consistent, historically when it has been used, it has been well tolerated. I can't say whether it's effective. And if one looks at the trials which are about to get underway, it's targeting, the whole spectrum of disease from post-exposure prophylaxis through early disease, outpatients, moderate disease, critically ill, as well as a pediatric population, although, comparatively less at risk. And so through those trials, I think, to answer your question, firstly, I think that there really are sufficient human data to support at least evaluation. I can't speak to whether it will be effective. Obviously that is definitely the hope. But yes, I do think that it is ready for evaluation.
And that brings us to the end of another edition of The Agenda. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher and Spotify. You can also find us on CGTN Europe Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.